Now that we know how to make our GUI look like what we want, we need to make it function the way we want. So far, we've created text fields, but nobody did anything with them. We've created buttons, but when you press them, nothing happened. Let's learn how to implement action listeners, and specifically we'll do that with buttons so that we can have something happen when we press the button. Let's get started. So, we've created buttons that look like what we want them to. We've been able to put them where we want. We've been able to change their background color, their label on them, the foreground color, and so on, but they don't do anything. In any GUI system, user interaction with a component generates an event that the operating system hands over to a program to respond to. This happens at the operating system level. Every time we move the mouse, events occur and get passed to somebody. Every time we type on the keyboard, every time if you have a touchpad that you use the touchpad, or if you have a touch screen and you use your finger or your stylus to touch the screen, whenever you click and drag on an object, events get generated and they get sent to somebody to handle. Most of them are ignored. If we want to listen for specific types of events and do something when those happen, we'll have to learn how to create and attach a listener. So the operating system will call our program when the button is pressed. So here's just some examples of events that could happen: pressing and releasing a button, selecting an item from a list, closing, minimizing, or maximizing a JFrame, and so on. Events contain information. They contain information about the type of event, and they contain information about which component generated the event. You have to explicitly listen for events, or they get ignored. To listen for an event, we have to create an action listener. An action listener is a class that implements the action listener interface. And then we have to register that to the component that we want to do the listening for. So here's the steps. Create a class that implements the action listener interface. Then create an object of the class that we created. That is our listener. Then we register that listener with the component's add action listener method. So let's see how that works with an extended example. Here I've got some code that's very similar to what we did in lessons 6B and 6C. My GUI is in a class called SampleFrame, which extends JFrame. I've got myself a J button that I've called Panic Button. I set the title, I get my content pane and make it a flow layout. My Panic Button is going to be a new button that has the label Panic. And here's what's brand new. I'm going to say Panic Listener. That has to be the name of a class that I've created. My listener, that's the name of the variable inside of this constructor that is of type Panic Listener, and it equals a new Panic Listener. I have to create a listener. I haven't done that on this page. That'll be on the next page. I have to create a listener, which is a class called Panic Listener. Once I've done that, I can say Panic Button, add an action listener, my listener. Notice this my listener is the name of the variable right up here that I've created as a type of this class that I have to build. So the Panic Button, whenever something happens, goes to this object and says, hey, do you know how to handle this? If so, it gets handled. Then I'm adding my Panic Button to the content pane, setting my size, setting it visible. I have to create the listener. I have to register it to the component. I haven't created the Panic Listener class yet. When I do, it's going to go right here, in between this brace and this brace. I'm going to create a class that's inside of the class SampleFrame. So nobody is going to be able to see it except SampleFrame. But that's going to be okay, because that's all that needs to see it. So I'm going to, in between this brace and this brace, put in a class for Panic Listener. And this is what goes in there. Class Panic Listener implements the Action Listener. It has to implement this interface. Now, when I implement an interface, remember that's like fulfilling a contract to have methods with specific signatures. The Action Listener interface wants me to have a method called Action Performed, which takes one parameter, an action event, that I'm choosing to just call E for event. So I have to define this method. This is the method that gets called when somebody is going to push that button. So I'm going to check if E.getSource. Remember, E is the event that gets passed in, and an event knows who generated the event. Check the source. If that equals the panic button, then I'm going to do whatever I want to do when the panic button is pushed. Maybe when the panic button is pushed, I change a message on the screen, or I change the color of something, or I quit the application. Whatever I want to do, I put the code in here. So notice the placement of that Panic Listener class. Up until now, all of our classes have resided in their own compilation units, their own files, and they've been completely separate from one another. But in that previous example, I inserted the definition of the Panic Listener class inside the sample frame class. I didn't have to. I could have made it into its own file, but it was convenient for me to embed it within sample frame. Why was it convenient? Well, nobody else except sample frame needs to use it, and it was easier to make the panic button variable visible to the listener when they were both inside the sample frame. Remember, I did something inside that listener that said, if the source of this event was the panic button, then do something. I need to be able to see the panic button from inside that class. Now, what are some of the things I could do in an action listener? Anything you can think of. I can modify some text on the screen. I can modify the appearance of the GUI, change colors, gray out features, move things around. I can make components appear or disappear. I can quit the application altogether. That's a useful thing to have. I do this by calling the method system.exit, passing it a 0 as a parameter. This says, end the application right now. Maybe you've got a button that says, all done, or quit. And when you press it, you want to exit the system. Now, what are some of the common events? A J button generates the event action event. That's the one that we saw in the example code that I did 2 pages ago. The method that gets called to handle this is action performed. So my listener had a method called action performed. If I had a checkbox, it would generate an event called item event. If I had a JList, it would generate an event called list selection event. If I had a JText field, it also would have an action event with the method called being action performed. Notice that's the exact same thing as for a J button. For J window, I get a window event. And depending on what that window event is, window open, window closed. For J component, I get a component event, or a focus event, or a key event, or a mouse event. Normally, I don't need to handle those. The default is fine. If I have a J menu item, which we'll do in our next lesson, I get an action event with the method action performed. Notice the menu item, the text field, the J button all use the exact same event and methods. Now, how do I find out more about this? I could go to the Java API online documentation and look up the package java.awt.event. Remember back in video 6b, I put the first couple of bullets of that in fine print on the screen and said it'll make more sense once you know a little bit more. Well, you know a little bit more now. You could look up information about events by going to this website.